And we are live. Thank you so much for joining me today. And this is part two of the segment that it was Words to Cast a Spell. I am Omi Inca, broadcasting from Omi's production studio. I'd like to welcome each and every one of you by saying Habari Gani, and also by saying that we were talking about literary writing. And I was explaining that the actual poetry that I write comes from the right side of my brain, and I actually write it while in meditation, while I am subliminally half awake and half asleep. And so I'm drawing information from the right side of the brain. Now, most of you know that The Journey of the Class Agent is out online and through lulu.com. However, I have an audio tape that I'm publishing to go with it. And that whole collection of 36 poems were poems that were written while under meditation, and they are poems that address life's issues. And the new book, entitled License to Preach, is about biblical issues pertaining to things that we've been struck with, like the virgin birth of Jesus, and the fact that terminology wasn't appropriately used because the word virgin was not even out during the time that they were publishing this Bible. But nevertheless, I go into detail about the word virgin and how in those days there was a trial marriage. So Mary went through a trial marriage, and while in the trial marriage at the virgin stage, she became pregnant. So in fact, that word did not necessarily mean she had never known a man. It really meant that that was a stage of her marriage relationship, the trial marriage. So if one would go back and research these things, they would see that there has been a play on words and people have mistaken the words. So in order to not to be disrespectful, but to clarify things so that people could better understand this pay-sure method that they were using to write with. And nevertheless, I tackle quite a few things in the License to Preach, and I talk about the Hosea, the coming forth of the Book of the Dead, by coming forth by day and night, the Book of the Dead, and how I urge people to let the netter teach them, and don't just let a preacher, teach them, but let the netter teach them. And I urge them to get involved with reading other materials, not just the Holy Bible, but the Netter from the Coming Forth by Day and Night, as well as the Hosea. So this breaks up the monotonous of saying every word has to rhyme. I'm really telling the story. So my poetry is storytelling, like epics. And some people have asked me to come and recite, and I fear that I might need to have my material with me on stage because I haven't committed all of it to memory. But nevertheless, it's an epical story where I submerge my mind under the subliminal mind, and while unconscious, these things are in my system that I've been studying about, so they come up. And when you're doing spontaneous writing or spontaneous poetry, that's what happens. Whatever is on the psychic mind, it actually comes up. So what I want to say is that we have got to get an understanding that poetry must be able to tell a story, take you on a journey. And with some of the poetry that I've written about, it is epical, rather lengthy, and it tells a story. But nevertheless, I wanted to introduce you to telling and writing while subliminally under a trance. Yes, you can get your mechanism working when you go into a deep rest and you submerge yourself underwater while half asleep and half awake. You are writing. And while writing, you're writing down things that you wouldn't normally know about in the natural while you're awake, but while under the subconscious, you begin to have detailed information about certain subjects. But I do like to say that I like to listen to music, and the music will take me to a place where I can begin to start writing and talking about a subject. I write about mostly relatives, close people that I know that I can go into depth with. One of the poems was about my sister's death while at the airport, and I didn't make the flight and was not able to get on a flight to fly in for her funeral. And I was devastated, and I didn't know any other way to fight other than to go within myself and to write about how I felt about that moment. So I wrote about it, and I wrote about what I saw. And it took me on a journey. I saw her death before she passed, and she was clutching her heart and screaming, and her children were in a disarray, involved in many things such as teenagers do. And I could sort of believe that maybe her house was in a disarray because she wasn't ready to go yet. This was her second stroke, and she was pushing back and holding back, trying to stay here. And her children went on with life, and they were still doing their thing. So I wrote about each one of the children, even though I didn't know these children, um, fully. I knew of them, but I had never traveled there to meet them. And I wanted to be there so badly because I wanted to be there to support them after the funeral. And I talked about, it couldn't have been, my sister's death couldn't have been prematurely because she didn't raise her children right. Or, could it have been because I didn't show up at the funeral and the family gathering? And had I showed up, could I have given them any advice? Maybe that could have saved my sister's life. But I went into detail in this whole poem, and it was rather lengthy. And some people, thought it was personal, but it was a way of me relieving myself of all of the anger that I had built up from not being able to get on this flight. So I released there, even though I wasn't there to moan at her funeral. So that was a prolific poem. And then the one poem that I wrote, that once I dreamed that I was Africa, and I began to take myself on a journey to Africa, and I experienced all of this uh, tropical seasonal opportunity to walk through the jungle where all the lions and tigers and bears were. But I was Mother Africa, so I wasn't worried about an attack or any extreme violence because I would receive the respect that I deserved because I was Mother Africa. So I could go to these forbidden places. And as I went through all of these different journeys in Africa, I visualized being there and becoming Mother Africa, and the and Mother Nature opening up to me and providing for me and supporting me, and the universe most of all of the elements, the water and fire, supporting me and being my backing. So then, this place that I had never been, that I longed to be and travel to, I had that experience through this dream while submerged under water in my subliminal mind. So I traveled the route of Africa, and I had been Mother Africa, so it wasn't so much of a letdown because I had never been there, because in my mind I had gone. Okay. Um, there was another prolific poem that centered around me growing up and bringing closure to my life and being able to plant myself and to plant a seed as a mentor for other children in my community to follow after me. And as I told the story that I was a brown-skinned, long-legged, skinny girl, and with my afro curl, because that's what was designated during that time, was to be natural. And at the same time, I took these young children through my life daily journey of traveling to school, having to fight to get on the bus, and then having to fight to get off the bus because there was always quarrels and fights. And I was centered around these fights, but yet I managed to get out of the whole school system with never a one fight, other than the fight that my niece started, and she thought we would assist her. And I said, no, no, because I wanted to be able to break free from the school knowing that I wasn't a violent person, even though violence was all around me. And this whole story tells a story of all of the graduating classes from my high school and what they went through. So, we wore the mini skirts and go-go boots, and men's dressed in walking suits and alpaca sweaters, you know, with men dressed up in their pleather. So this whole story unfolds what we were when we were growing up and what we had become. But yet we had come from the murder capital of the world. Why, we sure wouldn't mount to anything one would think. But many of us, like Michael Jackson himself and their family, we all mounted to something. And it was a way of releasing ourselves from this bad rap about the murder capital of the world and seeing the goodness and the good things that we had attached ourselves to there in the murder capital of the world. But nevertheless, we didn't see it as that. It was just groups of men fighting for their territory on the bus and who were challenging each other, sharpening their skills. So that poem was real for me because it brought to life when I was a little girl up until the time I became an adult and ready to graduate and go off to college. But poetry becomes like an epic for me. I've had a lot of epic journeys in my life, and I wanted to write about them because sometimes, you make it become real when you write about it. So I kept a journal and jotted down most pertinent things that happened to me in my life, and then I would write about them later. Sometimes I would record them. I do a lot of my work from recording the message on the answering machine, then going back to play it, and then filling in the trimmings around it. It's sort of like baking a cake. You bake it and then you let it cool off, and then you come back with the icings and add the trimmings around it. So it becomes like layers. Some people write in different ways. I like to record. I also like to sing in some of my poetry. If I'm doing an epic, for example, Afriye. Afriye is the story of an African girl, and I retell the story, but I create a song that goes with it, and trying to allow Afriye to release and to release herself, and knowing that we were there to make sure that she wouldn't have to go through this difficult thing of the rape. And we came back to settle the score for her, to let her know that all this that she went through was not in vain. But the story took place on a slave ship. I envisioned myself being on a slave ship with Afriye as she went through this terrible, horrible thing of being raped by these men on a ship. And I tried to imagine what she would have done, and letting her know that her life was not in vain, because we are here to tell her story, and we're not going to let her life be in vain. But Afriye is a famous story itself, but I recreated a poem from it and a song that went with it. And a lot of my poems have songs attached to it, and the songs sometimes help me through the poem to get to the next level. And many people use different genres to write, and everything sometimes doesn't rhyme. Like with me, I try to make sure that every other word is rhyming as I tell the story and it unfolds. So people get drawn into the story and they forget that this is a long, epic, long story. Now, I also have written a poem that has won notarized um, uh, the right to be in an anthology, and that poem was called "The Scar," and talking about how racism, classism, sexism all creates a scar. It's invisible but mostly unseen to the average eyes of the human being, but the scar is nevertheless there. So it gives me an opportunity to write about the unfairness and the racism and the impartiality that's in the world, and I could hand it to them on a platter. It creates a scar. All I know is it's a wound that's left behind. Now, us African people have gone through so much that we don't get to tell our story. We sometimes have to take our hurt and bury it inside, and then it shows up as an emotion. It shows up as a deficit, or it shows up as depression, and we never get to the heart of what is the matter. But poetry is a way of working out your anger, your frustration, your fears, and it gives you a chance to unleash your anger on the world. And sometimes it comes out in different forms, like paint on a wall. So when you develop that poem, you say, well, so this is what it was all about. Like when I explained to you the story about me not being able to attend my sister's funeral. That was what it was all about, that poem. I put it all in a nutshell, and I unfolded it within that poem. So then now I can put it on the shelf and I don't have to carry it inside of me. But nevertheless, my poetry was recited overseas on Mother's Day, so I became an international poet. I don't talk about it as much, and I had claimed that I was going to put more emphasis on my poetry and really, getting back into my poetry and doing more stage performances. But nevertheless, a good writer tried to take the time to put the attention into novels. And right now I'm writing my thesis on the effects that females. Get out of there! Willie, he's here. He's here. Dishwasher. And I'm going to bring this to a close and make it slow it down a bit. And we'll be back at you again tomorrow. Thank you.